Tristan Thornwell threw open the door of the waiting taxi, slid into the back seat, and barked, "7th Avenue now." His phone buzzed relentlessly in his palm, emails pouring in, but he ignored them. Today had been a disaster, a botched acquisition, a PR nightmare, and to top it all off, his driver had been nowhere to be found. He just needed to get to his penthouse and put out fires from there. "Sure, boss," came a light, teasing voice from the driver's seat. Tristan's head snapped up. This wasn't his usual driver. In fact, the person behind the wheel wasn't even a man. A woman with warm brown eyes and a playful smirk glanced at him through the rearview mirror, her auburn hair spilling over her shoulder. "Wait, who are you?" he demanded. She raised an eyebrow. "I should be asking you that. You just jumped into my car like you own it." Tristan's sharp gaze darted around the interior. It wasn't the sleek black sedan his driver usually pulled up in. It was an older but well-maintained blue car, its dashboard decorated with little trinkets and a faded air freshener shaped like a pineapple. His jaw clenched. "This isn't a taxi, is it?" "Nope," he exhaled sharply. "Then why didn't you say anything when I got in?" She shrugged, a grin tugging at her lips. "You looked like you were in a hurry, thought I'd help out." Tristan ran a hand down his face. "Of all the things that could go wrong today, I'll just get out." He reached for the door handle. A sudden downpour slammed against the windshield, rain drumming heavily on the roof. The streets were already congested, and pedestrians scrambled for cover. "On second thought," he muttered, glancing at the chaotic streets, "maybe I'll stay until we hit a clearer area." "Suit yourself," she said cheerfully, turning her attention back to the road. "I was heading in that direction anyway." Tristan sat back, studying her. "What's your name?" "Lena Graves." "And you're just driving around picking up strangers for fun?" Lena laughed. "No, I'm a freelance driver. People hire me for rides, kind of like a personal chauffeur, except way less fancy." He arched a brow. "And you didn't think to clarify that before I got in?" "Honestly," she shot him a mischievous look, "I was curious to see how long it would take you to notice." For the first time that day, Tristan felt a flicker of amusement. Lena navigated through the city with ease, weaving through traffic like she'd been driving these streets her whole life. She hummed along to the music playing softly in the background, completely unfazed by the storm. Something about her was refreshing, unfiltered. He was used to people walking on eggshells around him, business partners who only spoke in calculated sentences. But Lena, she didn't seem the least bit intimidated. "So, mystery man," she said, glancing at him in the mirror. "You gonna tell me your name, or do I keep calling you boss?" He hesitated for half a second before saying, "Tristan." She nodded. "Nice to meet you, Tristan. You look like you just survived a war." He let out a dry chuckle. "Feels like it. Bad day. The worst. Want to talk about it?" Tristan almost laughed at the absurdity of the situation. He, a billionaire CEO, sitting in the back of a stranger's car, pouring his frustrations to a woman he'd just met. And yet, he found himself speaking. He kept it vague, just mentioning a business deal gone wrong, the endless pressure, the suffocating expectations. Lena listened without interrupting, nodding every so often. When he finished, she said, "Sounds like you need a break." He scoffed. "Not an option." "Why not?" "Because that's not how my world works." Lena shook her head. "That's a terrible way to live." Tristan blinked. No one had ever said that to him before. Most people either admired his success or envied it, but no one ever questioned whether it made him happy. Before he could respond, she pulled over. "Here you are, 7th Avenue, she announced. Tristan glanced out the window. He hadn't even noticed how much time had passed. He reached for his wallet. "How much do I owe you?" Lena waved him off. "Nah, this one's on me." "Best wrong taxi ride of my life." He stared at her. "You're not serious." "Dead serious." She grinned. "Besides, you needed it." Tristan hesitated. He could easily transfer her an amount that would make up for it, but something told him she wouldn't accept it. Instead, he did something impulsive. He pulled out a sleek black business card and handed it to her. "If you ever need anything," he said, "call me." Lena took the card, turning it over in her fingers. "A CEO, huh? Explains the expensive suit and the 1,000-yard stare." He smirked. "Something like that." She tucked the card into her jacket. "Well, Tristan, take care of yourself. Try not to jump into any more random cars." And with that, she drove off into the rain, leaving Tristan standing there watching her go. He didn't know why he felt a strange pull in his chest, like he'd just let something important slip through his fingers. But he knew one thing for sure. This wasn't the last time he'd see Lena Graves. Tristan Thornwell did not get distracted. His life was a meticulous series of calculated moves, each decision a step toward maintaining the empire he'd built. And yet, for the past 3 days, his mind kept drifting to a woman who wasn't even supposed to be in his orbit. Lena Graves. The way she had effortlessly handled the city's chaos, the ease with which she'd teased him, it was unsettling. People didn't talk to him like that. They didn't challenge him. And they certainly didn't make him feel like just another person in the backseat of their car. He told himself it was nothing, a fleeting moment of intrigue, soon to be forgotten. But when his assistant knocked on his office door, interrupting his focus for the 3rd time that afternoon, he realized he hadn't gotten a single thing done. "Sir, the investors from Zurich are on the line," she reminded him, her eyes flicking to the untouched reports on his desk. Tristan barely registered her words. Instead, his gaze landed on the sleek black business card tray beside him. The one that now held a single card missing from its usual pristine order. Lena still had his number. Without thinking, he reached for his phone. Lena was elbow deep in an oil change when her phone buzzed. She wiped the grease from her fingers onto an already ruined rag and grabbed it, expecting a client. Instead, an unfamiliar number flashed across the screen. She almost ignored it, but something in her gut told her to pick up. "Lena Graves," she answered. A familiar voice responded. "I assume you don't usually get calls from CEOs." She laughed, recognizing the deep, commanding tone instantly. "Tristan Thornwell. I was starting to think you were just another guy who gave out his number for no reason. I don't do things without reason." She could practically hear the confidence in his voice, the unwavering certainty of a man who never second-guessed himself. "So what's the reason for this call then?" she asked, leaning against the side of the car she was working on. A pause, then, "I need a driver." Lena blinked. "You have a driver." "I need a new one," he corrected smoothly. She tilted her head. "You're hiring me." "On a trial basis," he said. "I have a gala in a few hours. I need someone reliable." Lena wasn't sure if she was more amused or suspicious. "And you think I'm reliable? You got me where I needed to go without asking for a dime. That's rare." She considered it. The pay would be better than any of her usual gigs, and honestly, she was intrigued. Tristan wasn't just some rich guy. He was sharp, controlled, and yet something about him felt restless. "All right, Thornwell," she said finally. "I'll be your driver. But don't expect me to wear a chauffeur's hat. I wouldn't dream of it." Lena pulled up to the towering glass building that housed Thornwell Global, the name emblazoned in sleek silver letters at the entrance. She barely had time to take in the grandeur before Tristan stepped out of the building, dressed in a midnight black tuxedo that looked like it had been tailored with surgical precision. He slid into the passenger seat, his cologne a mix of something dark and expensive filling the car. "You don't sit in the back?" she asked, throwing the car into drive. "If I'm going to be stuck in a car for an hour, I'd rather have a conversation." She chuckled. "You must really be bored of corporate talk if you're slumming it with a freelance driver for entertainment." "Maybe I just enjoy a change of pace." She glanced at him. "You don't strike me as a man who likes change." His lips twitched. "You'd be surprised." The rain had started again, soft and steady against the windshield, blurring the city lights into a hazy glow. "So what's this gala for?" she asked. "A charity event. Thornwell Global sponsors a number of outreach programs." Lena raised a brow. "Let me guess, networking disguised as philanthropy." His expression didn't shift, but something in his gaze sharpened. "Not everything is a calculated move." She studied him for a moment before turning back to the road. "Fair enough." Silence settled between them, not uncomfortable but charged in a way that made Lena acutely aware of his presence. After a moment, Tristan spoke again. "Why do you drive?" The question caught her off guard. "Because I like it." "That's not an answer," she exhaled, keeping her hands steady on the wheel. "Because it's mine. My car, my hours, my rules. No one breathing down my neck. Freedom." "Exactly." He was quiet for a second. "Then, and yet, you agreed to work for me." She shot him a smirk. I said trial basis, don't get ahead of yourself. Tristan let out a low chuckle, a sound so rare it surprised even him. They pulled up to the event, a grand building lined with red carpets and flashing cameras. He undid his seatbelt and turned to her. Wait here, she raised a brow. You think I'm going to abandon you in the middle of your big night? I think you'll get bored, Lena grinned. Try me. Without another word, Tristan stepped out, seamlessly slipping into the role of the untouchable CEO as cameras turned toward him. Lena watched him go, tapping her fingers against the steering wheel. She wasn't sure what she'd just gotten herself into. But something told her this was only the beginning. Lena drummed her fingers on the steering wheel, watching the grand event unfold from her parked position across the street. The gala was a glittering spectacle of wealth and power, with men in sharp tuxedos and women in shimmering gowns stepping out of sleek black cars, their laughter carried by the cool evening breeze. She could see Tristan moving smoothly through the crowd, his presence commanding attention without effort. He was at ease in this world, exchanging handshakes and measured smiles, but something about him felt just as distant as it had in the car. She wasn't sure why she was still here. She could have driven off, left him to his night of business and prestige, but something rooted her in place. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the way Tristan Thornwell, a man who seemed like he had everything under control, looked just a little less untouchable when he was around her. A sharp knock on the passenger side window jolted her from her thoughts. She turned to find a man in a navy suit peering in, his expression slightly bemused. You waiting for Tristan? He asked as she rolled down the window. Lena raised a brow. That depends. Who's asking? He chuckled. Elliot Carter, business partner. He inclined his head toward the gala. You're not his usual driver. She leaned back in her seat, assessing him. No, I'm not. Elliot studied her for a beat before nodding approvingly. Interesting. Lena crossed her arms. Is it? Tristan doesn't usually keep unfamiliar people around, Elliot mused. He's particular. I'm not exactly part of his inner circle, she pointed out. Elliot's lips quirked. Not yet. Before she could respond, the doors to the gala swung open and Tristan emerged, looking every bit the composed CEO. But as he approached, his gaze locked onto Elliot with something unreadable in his expression. What are you doing here? Tristan asked, his tone polite but firm. Just saying hello, Elliot replied. Didn't know you'd brought company tonight. Lena glanced between them, sensing an undercurrent of something unspoken. Tristan's attention flickered to her, his expression unreadable. She's my driver, Elliot hummed, clearly unconvinced but amused nonetheless. Right, well, I won't keep you. He gave Lena a nod before stepping away. Tristan opened the passenger door without hesitation. Move over. Lena blinked at him. Excuse me, I'm driving. She let out a surprised laugh. You, mister, I have a driver everywhere I go. He didn't respond, just held her gaze expectantly. Something about the way he looked at her made her pulse quicken. After a beat, she sighed and slid into the other seat. Fine. But if you scratch my car, I get to pick one of yours to keep. A rare flicker of amusement crossed his face as he settled behind the wheel. Deal. He pulled away from the curb, maneuvering the car with a precision that told her he wasn't new to driving, despite his usual reliance on chauffeurs. Lena glanced at him. So what was that back there? What was what? Your tense little exchange with Elliot. Tristan's fingers tightened briefly on the wheel before he relaxed his grip. Elliot likes to think he knows more than he does. Lena tilted her head. And does he? For a moment, Tristan didn't answer. Then, finally, he said, he knows I don't let people into my life easily. She studied him, taking in the way his jaw tightened just slightly. And yet here you are, driving my car. He glanced at her, something unreadable in his gaze. Here I am. The city lights blurred past them as they drove in comfortable silence. The tension from earlier faded, replaced with something quieter, something neither of them seemed willing to define just yet. Eventually, Tristan pulled onto a quieter street, parking in front of a small late-night cafe. Lena raised a brow. Didn't peg you for a coffee at midnight kind of guy. He cut the engine and turned to her. You said you like things on your terms. Consider this a detour. She considered him for a moment before shrugging. All right, Thornwell, lead the way. He got out and she followed, stepping into the warm, inviting space of the cafe. The scent of fresh coffee and baked goods filled the air, a stark contrast to the cold, polished world of the gala. They settled into a booth by the window, and for the first time since she met him, Tristan looked at ease. Lena sipped her coffee. So what do CEOs talk about when they're not making million-dollar deals? He leaned back in his seat, watching her. What do freelance drivers talk about when they're not picking up lost businessmen? She smirked. Touché. For the next hour they talked, really talked. Not about business or wealth, but about things that actually mattered. Lena told him about growing up in the city, about how she'd always loved driving because it made her feel like she was in control of her own path. Tristan, in turn, shared pieces of himself that he rarely gave away: the pressures of being who he was, the expectations that came with his name. Somewhere along the way, the walls between them started to crack, and neither of them seemed in a hurry to build them back up. Tristan had never been one to linger over coffee, let alone lose track of time in a quiet cafe with a woman who wasn't part of his meticulously structured world. And yet, there he was, watching Lena laugh as she stirred her drink, her fingers idly tracing the rim of the ceramic mug. Something had shifted between them. He could feel it. A slow, undeniable pull that had nothing to do with logic and everything to do with the way she made him feel: unburdened, unguarded, something dangerously close to free. But freedom wasn't something Tristan Thornwell indulged in easily. The night had stretched on longer than either of them intended, and when they finally stepped back into the city air, he hesitated before unlocking her car. He didn't want the night to end. Lena seemed to sense it too, her gaze meeting his in the dim glow of the streetlights. "So, Thornwell," she said, her voice carrying that ever-present teasing lilt, "are you going to admit you enjoyed yourself, or are you going to pretend this was just another business transaction?" Tristan exhaled, shaking his head. "You really don't let up, do you?" she grinned, leaning against the car. "Not a chance." For a moment, he just looked at her. The ease with which she stood there, the way she met his gaze without hesitation. She wasn't afraid of him. She wasn't trying to impress him or outmaneuver him. She simply was, and that, more than anything, made his carefully constructed walls strain under the weight of something unfamiliar. He reached into his pocket, pulling out his sleek black wallet. He could see the way her expression shifted, the playful edge dimming ever so slightly. "You're paying me now?" she asked, her voice quieter than before. Tristan shook his head, tucking the wallet away. "No, I was going to offer you a job." Lena tilted her head, curiosity flickering across her features. "A job? Full-time driver?" "No trial basis." She studied him for a long moment. "Why?" Tristan exhaled, stepping closer, his hands slipping into his pockets. "Because I trust you." Lena blinked, clearly not expecting that answer. He wasn't sure he expected it either, but it was the truth. Since the moment he'd stepped into her car, things had felt different. She had seen him the man, not the CEO. And now, he realized he didn't want to go back to a world where she wasn't around. But Lena wasn't someone who could be bought, and he knew it. She crossed her arms, considering his words. "You trust me, huh?" "Yes." Her lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to say something but wasn't sure if she should. Then, after a pause, she let out a small, breathy laugh. "You're either the boldest man I've ever met or the most reckless. Possibly both," she exhaled, shaking her head. "You realize I'm not like the people you usually hire, right?" "That's the point." Lena searched his face, as if trying to find some hidden catch, some reason to say no. But when she found nothing but sincerity, she let out a resigned sigh. "Fine, but I have conditions." Tristan arched a brow. "Naturally. No suits in the car unless absolutely necessary," she listed off, holding up a finger. "No treating me like an employee when we're outside of business hours. And definitely no pretending you're not enjoying my company when you clearly are." He let out a rare, quiet laugh. "Agreed." Lena pushed off the car, unlocking it. "Then I guess you've got yourself a driver." As they slid into the vehicle, Tristan realized something unsettling. This wasn't just about convenience, it wasn't just about trust, it was about her. And the fact that, for the first time in years, he wanted something that had nothing to do with power or control. He wanted Lena Graves. The following weeks passed in a blur of late-night drives, stolen moments between meetings, and an unspoken shift in the air every time their gazes met. Lena had seamlessly integrated herself into his world, though never on anyone's terms but her own. She refused to be intimidated by the grandeur of his lifestyle, rolling her eyes at his penthouse view like it was just another window and scoffing at the idea of him needing security to move through the city. But what unsettled Tristan the most was how much he liked it, how much he liked her. One evening, as she drove him through the city after a long day, he found himself watching her instead of the skyline. She caught him staring and raised an eyebrow. "Something on my face," he shook his head, a slow exhale escaping him. "No," Lena glanced at him before turning her attention back to the road. "You're acting weird, Thornwell." "I don't do weird," she laughed. "You do now." Tristan hesitated, then spoke. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if I'd gotten into the right car that night?" Lena's grip on the steering wheel tightened slightly, but her expression remained light. "You mean if we'd never met?" "Yes." She was quiet for a moment, then finally said, "I think you'd still be the same man, just a little less interesting." Something about that answer made his chest tighten, because he wasn't sure he would be the same man at all. And the thought of a life without her in it, he didn't like it, not one bit. Before he could respond, Lena pulled into the driveway of his building and turned off the engine. "Well, boss, you're home." Tristan didn't move, neither did she. The silence between them stretched, thick with something neither of them dared name. Finally, Lena sighed, turning to meet his gaze. "You're thinking too hard," he inhaled sharply. "You have no idea," she studied him, something unreadable in her expression. Then slowly, she leaned in, closing the distance between them just enough for him to feel the warmth of her presence. "If you want to kiss me, Thornwell," she murmured, her voice teasing but soft, "you're going to have to stop overthinking it." Tristan Thornwell never hesitated, until now. But only for a second. Then, before doubt could creep in, he leaned in and captured her lips with his. And suddenly, nothing else mattered. Tristan wasn't a man who second-guessed himself. He made decisions with precision, struck deals without hesitation. But as Lena's lips met his, as the warmth of her touch sent a shiver through him, he realized this was different. This wasn't a calculated move or a carefully laid plan. This was instinct, and it was dangerous. Lena pulled back just enough to search his face, her breath mingling with his in the quiet of the car. She wasn't uncertain if anything. She looked amused, as if she had known this moment was coming long before he had. "Well," she murmured, "that answers that question." Tristan exhaled, his fingers still resting lightly against her jaw. "Which question?" Lena's lips curved into something playful. "Whether or not Mr. CEO knows how to let go." He let out a short breath, a mixture of a laugh and an exhale as he shook his head. "You make it impossible not to." She leaned back into her seat, watching him with something unreadable in her expression. "That's the thing about you, Thornwell. You're always in control. Always thinking 10 steps ahead." Tristan shifted, sensing the weight behind her words. Lena tapped her fingers against the steering wheel, her gaze flicking to the towering building beside them. "But this isn't something you can plan for, is it?" No, it wasn't, and that terrified him. Tristan had spent years building a life that left no room for unpredictability. His world was structured, disciplined, a fortress of control that protected him from distractions, from mistakes. But Lena Graves had walked straight past those walls like they had never existed in the first place. He could see the question in her eyes, the silent challenge. Was he going to let himself have this? Or was this just another moment he would rationalize away? Tristan reached for the door handle, hesitating for only a fraction of a second before speaking. "Come upstairs." Lena's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Is that an order or an invitation?" He held her gaze, his voice softer than usual. "It's whatever you want it to be." She studied him for a long moment before letting out a slow breath. "You know," she said, turning off the car, "I think you might actually be interesting after all, Thornwell." Tristan's penthouse was a testament to wealth and precision, floor-to-ceiling windows showcasing the city's skyline, sleek furniture that looked as if it had never been touched. Everything was in its place, curated, perfect, and yet for the first time it felt too pristine. Lena wandered in without hesitation, running her fingers along the polished countertop in the open kitchen. Let me guess, she said, glancing at him over her shoulder. You don't actually use this kitchen. Tristan loosened his tie, leaning against the doorway. I have people for that. Lena scoffed. Of course you do. He watched as she moved through the space, completely at ease. She didn't gawk at the luxury, didn't comment on the absurd square footage or the view that real estate agents would call priceless. Instead, she turned to him, tilting her head. You ever just stop, Thornwell? Tristan's brow furrowed. Stop? Yeah, she said, gesturing around. Stop thinking, stop planning. Just exist? The question made something tighten in his chest. He had spent so long moving forward, making sure every detail of his life was accounted for, that the idea of simply stopping felt foreign. He didn't answer. Lena seemed to sense it. She exhaled, shaking her head before walking toward the floor-to-ceiling windows. The city stretched beneath them, a living, breathing thing, lights flickering like stars trapped in glass. This view, she mused, it's beautiful. Tristan stepped up beside her, his gaze shifting from the skyline to her profile. You see this every day, he pointed out. Not like this, he frowned. What do you mean? Lena turned to face him, her expression softer now. I drive through these streets, I see this city from the ground up, but up here it's different. She glanced back at the skyline. It's quieter. Almost like it belongs to you. Tristan studied her, the way the city lights reflected in her eyes, the way she stood there as if she was meant to be here all along. For the first time in years, he wanted something not because it made sense, not because it was part of some grand plan, but simply because it was her. And that was more terrifying than anything else. Lena. She looked up at him, waiting. He should have told her this was a mistake. That he didn't do things like this, that she was a complication he hadn't accounted for. But instead he reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face. I don't know how to stop, he admitted. Lena's lips parted slightly, as if she hadn't expected the honesty. Then slowly, she placed her hand against his chest, just over his heartbeat. Then let me show you how. The next morning, Tristan woke to the unfamiliar sensation of warmth beside him. Lena was still asleep, her hair spilling over the pillow, her breathing even. For a moment, he just watched her, letting the quiet settle over him. It was unsettling, this feeling the sense that something had shifted, that nothing would be the same after this. And yet, for the first time, he wasn't afraid of it. Carefully, he reached over, brushing his fingers lightly over her wrist. Lena stirred, blinking up at him with sleep-heavy eyes. Morning, Thornwell, she murmured, her voice husky from sleep. Tristan felt something uncoil in his chest. Morning, he said softly. Lena stretched, letting out a content sigh. So, she said, turning to face him fully. What now? Tristan could have given her the usual answer, the one he would have given anyone else. That this was temporary, that they would go back to their roles, that nothing had to change. But looking at her now, the words felt hollow, because everything had already changed. He reached out, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. Now, he said, I stop. Lena's lips curved, her fingers tracing lazy circles against his arm. Good, she murmured. Took you long enough. Tristan let out a quiet laugh, pulling her closer. For the first time in his life, he didn't care about the next move, the next deal, the next step. Because for once, he was exactly where he wanted to be. Tristan stepped out onto the balcony, the city stretching endlessly below him. The morning air was crisp, carrying the distant hum of traffic, but none of it felt as important as the woman inside his penthouse. Lena. She had fallen back asleep in his bed, tangled in his sheets as if she had always belonged there. It was unsettling, the way she had slipped so effortlessly into his life, rearranging everything he thought he knew about himself. He had spent years keeping people at a distance, ensuring that no one got close enough to become a liability. And yet, she had undone him in a matter of weeks. The realization should have sent him retreating, should have made him step back before things spiraled further out of control. But for the first time, he didn't want control. He wanted her. The balcony door slid open behind him, and he turned to find Lena standing there, wrapped in one of his shirts. The sleeves swallowed her hands, the hem brushing the tops of her thighs. You disappeared, she murmured, her voice still thick with sleep. Tristan leaned against the railing, his eyes tracing over her. Just thinking. Lena padded forward, stopping beside him. That sounds dangerous for a man like you, he he exhaled, shaking his head. You have a habit of making me rethink everything. She studied him, her expression unreadable for a long moment. Then, instead of teasing, she simply said, "Good." Tristan reached for her, his fingers brushing over the inside of her wrist before linking their hands together. It was such a simple gesture, but it grounded him in a way nothing else ever had. Lena squeezed his hand. "You're worried." He hesitated before nodding. "This isn't just a passing thing, Lena, and I don't do things halfway." She tilted her head, watching him. "Do you think I do?" "No," he admitted. "That's what scares me." Lena let out a slow breath, her gaze steady. "Then maybe you need to stop being scared." Tristan turned to her fully, his grip on her hand tightening. "I don't want to lose this." "You won't," she said softly. "Unless you run from it." He didn't run. Instead, he pulled her closer, pressing a slow, deliberate kiss to her lips. It was an answer, a promise, and for once there was nothing uncertain about it. The days that followed were different. Tristan had always lived with a sharp, relentless focus, but now he found himself distracted in the best way. Lena was everywhere, waiting in the car when he finished meetings, stealing his attention with a knowing glance, calling him out when he worked too late. She had become part of his world, but more than that, she had become necessary, and that terrified him. One evening, as she drove him back from a late investors' dinner, he found himself watching her instead of the road ahead. The streetlights cast shifting shadows across her face, highlighting the quiet confidence she carried so effortlessly. "You're staring again," she said without looking over. Tristan didn't deny it. "I was thinking." Lena huffed a quiet laugh. "You really have to stop doing that." He ignored her teasing. "I want you with me." She glanced at him, something flickering behind her eyes. "Pretty sure I already am." "No," he said, his voice firmer now. "Not just as my driver." "I want more." Lena shifted gears, her fingers tightening around the wheel. "What are you saying, Tristan?" He reached over, covering her hand with his. "I'm saying I don't want this to be temporary." For the first time since he'd met her, she looked genuinely caught off guard. "You're serious," she murmured. "I've never been more serious about anything." Lena pulled the car to a stop in front of his building, but neither of them moved. She turned to him fully now, searching his face. "Are you sure you know what you're asking for?" Tristan nodded. "I don't want a life where you're not in it, Lena." For a moment, she just looked at him, as if trying to find any cracks in his resolve, but there were none. Then, slowly, a smile spread across her lips, the kind that made his chest tighten. "Well, Thornwell," she said, "took you long enough." Weeks turned into months, and for the first time in his life, Tristan understood what it meant to have something worth holding on to. Lena was no longer just his driver. She was the person he reached for in the middle of the night, the one who challenged him, softened him in ways he never thought possible. And he wanted forever. So, standing on the rooftop of his penthouse, with the city sprawling beneath them, he pulled a small velvet box from his pocket. Lena leaned against the railing, sipping from a glass of wine, oblivious to the storm raging in his chest. He cleared his throat and she turned, raising a brow. "You're fidgeting," she noted. "That's new." Tristan exhaled sharply. "I had a plan for this." Lena's lips twitched. "Of course you did." He took a step closer, his fingers brushing over her cheek. "But plans don't seem to work with you." She tilted her head, curiosity flickering in her expression. "Tristan, what are you?" Before she could finish, he dropped to one knee. Lena froze, her breath catching. Tristan looked up at her, his heart pounding harder than any boardroom negotiation ever had. "I love you," he said simply. "I love you in a way I never thought I could love anyone. And I don't want another day to pass without you knowing that." Lena's eyes softened, her fingers trembling slightly as they reached for his. Tristan opened the box, revealing the ring, a sleek, elegant band that reflected everything he felt for her. "Marry me, Lena." For a moment, she just stared at him, as if trying to process the weight of his words. Then, in one swift motion, she dropped to her knees in front of him, cupping his face. "You are absolutely ridiculous," she whispered. Tristan let out a breathless laugh. "That's not a no." Lena grinned, pressing her forehead against his. "No, Thornwell, it's a yes." And as he slipped the ring onto her finger, he knew with absolute certainty she had been the only decision that had ever truly mattered. The wedding was nothing like the grand, over-the-top galas Tristan was used to. It was small, intimate, a quiet ceremony on a rooftop overlooking the city where it all began. Lena stood before him in a simple, breathtaking dress, her hands in his, her eyes filled with something that made his chest ache. As they exchanged vows as he promised her forever, he realized something. For the first time, he wasn't just living for success, for control, for power. He was living for her, and that was more than enough.